We are live. Hello and welcome to another episode of Help Me Believe, the show about Christian apologetics and theology. My name is Haden Clark, your host, and I am excited to introduce my special guest to you. His name is Dr. Andrew Loke. He is a professor at Hong Kong Baptist University, and he is he is the author of this book right here. I don't know if I can get that in the shot. God and Ultimate Origins. That's what we're going to be discussing today. It's a great book. It'll be linked in the description below. You should get a copy of that from the Amazon link there. But Dr. Loke, thanks so much for joining me, sir. I really appreciate it. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you, Haden. Thanks for inviting me on your program.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this. I'm sure you got a busy schedule, being a professor and all. Of course, you're hailing all the way from Singapore, I think you said. I think that might be the furthest guest that I've had on the show, so congratulations. You've won the longest distance contest there. But yeah, I really appreciate you doing this. And for those in the audience who may or may not be familiar with who you are, I thought it might be helpful if you give us a brief introduction, kind of who you are and what you do.
Sure. So my name is Andrew Loke. I'm an associate professor at the Hong Kong Baptist University, and I teach philosophy of religion, science and religion, as well as the history of Christian thought. I did my PhD at King's College London, and I have written a few books on philosophy of religion and historical studies of early Christianity. So, for example, the book The Origin of Divine Christology, published by Cambridge University Press, and The Cryptic Model of the Incarnation, which is on how we understand the divine and human attributes of Christ, and also a book that is coming out soon called Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ, which looks into the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And of course, this book which you just mentioned, the book called God and Ultimate Origins, which talks about the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God.
Yeah, so you're writing a book on the resurrection. You're really going to span the whole spectrum there. You're going to have one on the argument for God. You got some theological books in there, and then you're going to have one on the historicity of the resurrection. That's very impressive. And the book is excellent. Again, you should get a copy. I'll leave a link in the description so you can get a copy of that. Dr. Loke, before we get into the book, tell me about kind of how you became a Christian, and then also how you became interested in the philosophy of religion.
Okay, so I became a Christian when I was 16 years old. At the time, I was looking for the meaning of life, and I found it in Jesus Christ. And so I became very excited about this, and I started to share with others about Jesus and how he can give us an abundant life and eternal life. And when I entered into university, I had a classmate who I had lots of conversation with. And so I was telling him about Jesus, and he was telling me about atheism. And he was claiming that, we need to, he was claiming that science can explain how the universe came about, and we don't need to believe in God. And so his objections to Christianity actually challenged me to think more rigorously about what I believe. And so I began to look for answers to his questions. And I'm very thankful to have found answers in the writings of many apologists and philosophers of religion. So people like Norman Geisler, William Lane Craig, I found their writings so helpful. And so that is how I became interested in philosophy of religion. And so I began to do my own research into this area.
Oh, very cool. That's kind of similar to how I became interested as well while I was in seminary, actually. I didn't have a friend or anybody that was objecting to my faith like you did, but just kind of had some doubts of my own, and so I kind of fell into it that way. I think that's kind of how a lot of people fall into the study of the philosophy of religion. So thanks for sharing that. Now, again, we are here to discuss the book for the third time. I'm going to leave a link in the description. You got to get a copy of this book. It's very good. And thank you to Dr. Loke for writing it. Tell me about how you got the idea for this book, and kind of just how the book God and Ultimate Origins came about.
Okay, so after I found the answers to my questions, I began to wonder, why is it not the case that other philosophers who are not Christians, why don't they buy into this? Why don't they also believe in God? So I sent an email to a philosophy professor at the National University of Singapore, and I summarized my own thoughts about the cosmological argument and sent it to him by email. And he referred me to another professor in Australia. His name is Graham Opie. He is one of the leading atheist philosopher in the world. Right?
Yeah,
And
I love Graham Oppie. He's an excellent philosopher. I like listening to him speak as well.
yeah, so he will give very detailed and rigorous critique, right, of the cosmological argument. And so I got in touch with him, and we had a very thorough email correspondence of about 120 emails. So 60 emails from me and 60 emails from him. It's going through the cosmological argument step by step in a very rigorous manner. And so for me, it's like taking a PhD under him.
Yeah.
And so he was raising all kinds of objections, right, to the cosmological argument, and I tried to think of responses to his objections. And so after the whole 120 email discussion, I realized that, wow, the cosmological argument is still defensible in spite of the detailed critique, right? And so I decided to do further work in this area, and eventually this becomes the book.
Yeah, that's pretty cool that it kind of came about through an email exchange there with Dr. Oppie. So let's talk about methodology a little bit. Like you were just saying a second ago, you had this friend who is claiming that science can explain everything, and perhaps there's those skeptics out there who would say that science is the only tool that we should be using to ask these sorts of questions. So what tools do we have at our disposal whenever we're investigating this question of the origins of the universe or ultimate origins?
Well, I think science is definitely one of the ways to find out the truth, right? But it is not the only way. Philosophy is another way, right, to discover the truth. In fact, science itself requires philosophy. And I think we can use both together, right, to help us discover the truth. For example, we have good scientific evidence to indicate that our universe has an ultimate origins, right? So other than the Big Bang theory, we have the generalized second law of thermodynamics, which also apply to quantum systems as well, and so which indicate that so prior to the Big Bang, many scientists think that it's a quantum era. But the generalized second law of thermodynamics, which has been used by physicist Aaron Wall at Cambridge University, he would use that to argue that even that era, that quantum era, must also have an ultimate beginning as well. And so this is one scientific evidence, right, for the ultimate origins. And in addition to that, we have at least 4 philosophical arguments to show that the universe has an ultimate origins. And these include the argument for the impossibility of concrete infinities. That's the first argument. Then the second argument is the argument for the impossibility of traversing an actual which is the argument I propose in the book is called, you might call it the argument for the viciousness of dependence regress. And I'll explain this later on. And then the fourth argument are all kinds of paradoxes, which shows the absurdity of an infinite regress. So, for example, the Grim Reaper paradox, which has been proposed by philosopher Alexander Proust at Baylor University. So there are multiple arguments, right, to show that the universe has an ultimate origins, scientific arguments and philosophical arguments, and any one of these, right, will be enough to establish the conclusion that the universe has an ultimate origin. So we don't need to defend all of them actually. No, in fact, any one of them will be enough, right, to prove the conclusion. So that even if one of these arguments fail, but the others succeed, right, the conclusion will still be established. Right. So in order for the atheist, right, to rebut the conclusion, he will have to rebut all four of these arguments as well as the scientific arguments as well. Right? Mm-hmm. And so it's not enough for the atheist to just rebut one of these arguments. He has to rebut all 4 of them. Yeah. And so I think the case is pretty strong, actually. And yeah, so let me say a bit more about the relationship between science and philosophy, because I think this is important. Because a lot of people have misunderstanding, right? A lot of people think that science is the only way to discover the truth. But as I said earlier on, science itself requires philosophical reasoning, right? So let me explain. So what is science, right? So a lot of people think that, well, science consists of experimentation, right, and observation, right? It's a systematic study of the world using observation and experimentation. And a lot of people think that, well, in order to prove anything, you need to test your theory, right, using experiments, right? The theory has to be testable, at least in principle, right? However, if we ask the question, right, why is testability an indication of truth, right? Why is experimentation an indication of truth, right? How is it that experiment help us to find out the truth? Now, you cannot answer this question by doing more experiments, right? You cannot do more experiments to show the value of you cannot do more experiments to show the value of experiments. Right? Rather, you have to explain, right? You have to explain why is it the case that experiments help you to find out the truth, right? And you have to talk about what is truth, what is evidence, and how does evidence lead us to the truth. You have to talk about prediction, which is used in science, and prediction requires philosophical reasoning like induction and deduction, as well as laws of logic, right? So the justification for these kinds of reasoning is not it's not based on science, but it's based on philosophy, right? So science requires philosophical reasoning in that sense, right? You need to explain why is it that deduction helps you to arrive at the truth. You need to explain why is it that laws of logic corresponds with truth, for example. And so all these are required for the foundation of science, and all this cannot be proven by experiments. Rather, their justification is based on philosophical reasoning. And so let me quote from a very well-known scientist. His name is George Ellis. He's one of the leading cosmologists in the world today. And so he notes that. So he asked the question: what are the criteria for a good scientific theory, right? So a good scientific theory should be internally consistent, planetary power, right? It should be as simple as possible, Occam's razor. Now, these criteria are philosophical in nature, in that they themselves cannot be proven to be correct by any experiment. Rather, their choice is based on past experience combined with philosophical reflection. And so this indicates that philosophical considerations are important for science, right? And so in view of this conclusion, cosmologists and scientists should not ignore the philosophical problems associated with certain models of the universe, such as problems concerning an infinite regress, right? And in fact, scientists who are well informed about the importance of philosophy have used philosophical arguments against an infinite regress to argue against cosmological arguments that postulate an infinite past. And George Ellis himself is one good example. He has used philosophical arguments as well, even though he's a scientist, but he also used philosophical arguments to show that the universe has an ultimate origins. And so this shows that philosophical arguments are relevant for modern cosmology. And philosophical arguments are what I developed in my book, right, to prove that the universe has ultimate origins, ultimate beginning.
And the four arguments that he mentioned, the four philosophical arguments that Dr. Loke mentioned, are spelled out more, obviously, in much more detail in the book. And we're not just going to gloss over them right here either. In just a minute, we're going to go over one of those. But before we get to that question, I want to ask you. So there's a number of different styles or different arguments, different cosmological arguments. So you have the Thomist cosmological argument. You have the Leibnizian cosmological argument. You have the Kalam cosmological argument, which the modern person is probably going to be more familiar with. At least anybody watching this will probably be more familiar with due to William Lane Craig, of course. And then, of course, the subtitle of your book is called A Novel Cosmological Argument. And so I'm wondering what the difference between the Thomist, the Leibnizian, the Kalam, and your own cosmological argument actually is. What makes your argument novel, I suppose?
Okay, so let me explain first the distinctions between the different types of cosmological arguments. Right, so the Leibnizian version of the cosmological argument basically tries to show that there's a necessary being, right? And so it is based on the distinction between contingency and necessity, right? So contingency being that some things could have been the case or could not have been the case, whereas a necessary being is something that it must be the case, right? So Leibniz tried to argue that there must be a necessary being, something that necessarily exists, and this being is God, right? Whereas the Thomist cosmological argument tries to show that there is a first sustaining cause of the universe. So what makes it the case that the universe continues? What makes it the case that the universe continues to exist moment by moment? Right? So Aquinas argues that there is a first cause that sustains the universe, that keeps the universe in existence. And so that, in a nutshell, is what Aquinas was trying to argue for. And the Kalam argument is different from the first two, right? So the Kalam argument tries to show that there is an ultimate beginning, right, to the universe, and that there's a first cause of time, right? There's a first cause that brought the universe into existence, that brought time into existence. And so that is what is unique about the Kalam argument. So the Kalam argument concerns the beginning of existence. And this idea of beginning, right, is somewhat absent in the first two arguments.
Yeah. And before we go on to your argument, I did want to jump in right there. Do you think that these three arguments succeed?
I'm still thinking about the Leibnizian and the Thomist argument. I haven't come to a firm conclusion yet. But I think the Kalam is, in my own opinion, I think the Kalam is the strongest version actually. And and the reason is because we have so many arguments, scientific and philosophical, right, to demonstrate the premise that the universe has an ultimate origins. As I said, there are at least 4 good arguments to show that, and we have good scientific evidence to show that conclusion as well. And so I think the premises are very strong for the Kalam, and that's the first reason. And the second reason is that the Kalam succeeds in demonstrating that the first cause must have libertarian freedom. It must be able to bring about the universe freely. And this idea of libertarian freedom is characteristics of agents, of personal agents, right? And so the Kalam not only demonstrates that there is a first cause, but demonstrates that this first cause is a kind of agent, a personal agent, and which is most closely associated with the attributes of God being a personal being, right? Whereas the others, cosmological argument, are pretty vague on this. So for example, the Leibnizian version shows that there's a necessary being, but why think that this necessary being is God, right? Why think that he's a personal God? And so on this point, the Leibnizian version will require help from other arguments. And so someone might try to combine the Leibnizian with the teleological argument to show that, well, the God, the necessary being will be some kind of designer, for example. And so the Leibnizian argument will require other kinds of arguments that to complement it, right, in order to show that the necessary being is God. That's in my own view. But the Kalam argument is able to stand on its own and demonstrates that the first cause is a necessary being, is a creator, right? Yeah. And that, of course, resonates with what the Bible says, right? That since the creation of the world, God's eternal attributes has been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, right? So that men are without excuse. Right? So people can know that there is a creator of the universe. And that is exactly what the Kalam argument demonstrates.
Okay. So thank you for clarifying that. Hate to jump in like that. But now go ahead and explain how your view differs from those 3 different cosmological arguments.
Well, so actually, my argument is version actually, but it is quite different from how the Kalam has been traditionally defended. In a sense that I add on one more argument that has some roots in the Thomist tradition. So that is what is unique. So let me explain. Let me elaborate. So traditionally, defenders of the Kalam, such as William Lane Craig, they have tried to defend the second premise, the universe has a beginning, using philosophical arguments such as the arguments for the impossibility of actual infinite, and also the arguments for the impossibility of traversing an actual infinite, right? The first 2 arguments which I mentioned earlier on, right? So that is how the Kalam has traditionally been defended. And these 2 arguments involves notions concerning infinities, right? So one has to try to prove that concrete actual infinite is impossible, or that it's impossible to traverse an actual infinite, right? Either one of them. Whereas my arguments doesn't require all these complicated discussions about infinities. It is based on the notion of dependence, right? And so such that even if, right, a concrete actual infinite is possible, and even if it's possible to traverse it, nevertheless there must still be a first cause, right? Because an infinite causal regress is a vicious causal regress, so there must still be a first cause. And this idea of the viciousness of the infinite regress is actually taken from the Thomistic philosophers who have argued for a kind of dependence for a first sustaining that requires a first sustaining cause, right? So they have used the requirement for dependence to argue for a first sustaining cause, whereas I use this notion of dependence to argue for a first cause of time. And so this is the unique contribution of my book, yeah. But before that, let me also clarify. In my book, I still show that the first two ways are defensible, actually. Right. So just now I mentioned that the argument for the impossibility of concrete infinities and the argument for impossibility of transversing and actual infinite, right? So I think that the first two arguments are still defensible and they are still good arguments. But I add on a third one, right, to these two. Yeah. And others have add on others as well, as mentioned, right? The Grim Reaper paradox, etc. Right? And so,
okay. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead and take us through the argument then, as briefly as possible. Just kind of what the argument actually is. How would you state the argument?
Okay. So to make things simple for everybody listening to this interview, let me start by using an analogy, right? So suppose I have no money. And the only way for me to begin to have money is to get it from you, Haden, right? Now, suppose that you also have, yeah, I hope you're not too poor at this moment. Right. Now, suppose that you also have no money, and the only way that you can get it, right, is to get it from William Craig, for example, right? So now, suppose William Craig is also in a similar situation, right? That he has no money and he needs to get it from someone else who also has no money, but who also needs to get it from someone else in order to begin to have money. Now, if everybody is in this kind of situation, then no one will ever begin to have money, right? Because all of us are kind of in debt, right? If everybody is in debt, right? One debtor borrowing from the other debtor, who also borrowing from the other debtors, and nobody has any money to start off with, nobody can begin to exist, nobody can begin to have money in the first place, then no one will ever start to have money, right? So a series of debtors, right, can never solve the problem of debt. Right? And what is required, right, is the first guy who either has money himself or who can create money, right, in order to solve the problems, right? So we need to have a source, right, the first source, right, in order to solve this problem. So likewise, before I begin to exist, I have no existence. I do not exist, right? And in order for me to begin to exist, my parents have to brought me into existence, right? But before they begin to exist, they also require their parents to bring them into existence, right? So if everything along the causal chain is in a similar situation, then no one will ever begin to exist. So it's just like no one will ever begin to have money, right? So what is required is a first cause, right? Something that always existed and which does not require other things to bring it into existence, and which has the capacity to bring other things into existence. So only such a first cause can answer the question, why did anything begin to exist in the first place, right? And so this is very briefly the argument for demonstrating why there must be a beginningless first cause, right, to bring other things into existence.
Mm-hmm. So could the universe have just always existed and then just not have needed any cause at all? Maybe the universe itself is just this thing that gives existence to all other things. It's the first source of existence.
Yes, this is a great question. And so in order to answer this question, we must think a bit more about what kind of properties this first cause must have, right? So just now I mentioned that this first cause must be without beginning, right? And moreover, this first cause must also be initially changeless. Right? Now, why is that the case? Well, the reason why is because change, right? When we talk about change is something that has a beginning, right? So, for example, I have changed from 1 year old to now I'm 45 years old. So I've changed, and what change means is something gaining or losing a property, right? So I have gained the property of being older, right? I have lost the property of being younger. So change is the gaining of losing of properties, and this gaining or losing involves a beginning, right? So I began to change. I have began to get older, right? So change is something that has a beginning, right? And there cannot be an infinite regress of change, right? Because as I explained earlier on, right, so for me to begin to exist, I need my parents to bring me into existence, right? So there cannot be an infinite regress of changes. And so what this means is that there must be a first change, a first event, right? Given the impossibility of an infinite regress of change, there must be a first change, right? Since the infinite regress of change is not possible, there must be a first change. Now, the first change cannot be uncaused, right? Because everything that begins to exist requires a cause. And so this is where we get to the defense of the causal principle, right? Which William Lane Craig puts it as premise number 1, right, in the traditional Kalam version, right? So in my defense, I put it further down, right? So I show that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And I defended this in chapter 5 of my book, where I offer a modus tollens argument to show that if something began to exist uncaused, then other kinds of things would also begin to exist uncaused. But it is not the case that other kinds of things begin to exist uncaused. And therefore, it is not the case that something begin to exist uncaused. Right? So this is a modus tollens argument, right? It denies the consequence, right? If P, then Q, right? Not Q, therefore not P, right? So this argument shows that it is not the case that something is not the case that something began to exist uncaused. And so what this means is that whatever begins to exist would have a cause, right? And so this conclusion shows that the first event must have a cause, right? And so the first change must be caused by something. And that something cannot be another change, right? Because and so that thing must be initially changeless, right? It must be changeless initially, and then as it brings about the first event, it also underwent a change, right? It also changed as it brought about the first event, and then we need to ask the next question: so how can something which is initially changeless begin to change? How does something that is initially changeless cause the beginning of change, right? Now, in order for something that is initially changeless to bring about a change, that first cause must have two capacities, right? The first is the capacity to begin the first event, to begin the first change, in a way that is not determined by prior events, right? And by the way, I should clarify, by events I mean a change, right?
Right.
So by event I mean a change, right? So the first cause must have the capacity to begin the first event in a way that is not determined by prior events, right? Because the first cause is the first, right? So it cannot be determined by something before it, right? And secondly, the first cause must also have the capacity to prevent itself from changing initially. For otherwise, the first cause would not have been initially changeless, right? And the reason is because the first cause and the first event, they are not co-eternal, right? They are not together. They are not always together, right? Why? Because the first event has a beginning, whereas the first cause has no beginning. Right? So the first cause, right? Rather, the first cause was without the first event initially, and then brought about the first event, right? Right. So in order for that to happen, right, the first cause must have those two capacities which I described, right? The capacity to initiate the first event, and also the capacity to prevent itself from initiating a first event, right? And so this capacity to be able to freely bring about the first events in a way that's not determined by prior events, and also to be able to freely prevent itself from changing. I mean, these two capacities, right, that describes what philosophers call libertarian freedom. Right. That it can bring about the first event by itself and also refrain from doing that, right? But also prevent itself from doing that. And so this characterizes libertarian freedom, and therefore the first cause must have libertarian freedom. And so in answer to your, so we have demonstrated that the first cause must be initially changeless, and the first cause must have libertarian freedom, and these two capacities characterize a creator, right? And so and therefore the first cause cannot be the material universe. Why? Because the material universe is in constant change, right? Based on our understanding of material, right? So when I say when I refer to materiality, I'm referring to matter as we know it by science, right? And science tells us that matter is constantly changing. That is in accordance with quantum physics. So, for example, the universe is a fluctuating quantum field according to quantum field theory, and the quantum vacuum is in a constant change. The quantum particles fluctuate in and out of existence in accordance with Heisenberg equations. So, science tells us that our universe is in the state of constant change. It was never initially changeless. And moreover, the universe doesn't have free will. I mean, the universe doesn't have libertarian freedom, right? The universe couldn't choose to do anything, right? It just followed the natural laws, right? And so the universe cannot be the first cause. Rather, the first cause must be some kind of creator, a kind of transcendent creator, a creator that is initially changeless, which means that it is also initially timeless in a way, right? If you understand according to the relational view of time, right? That time is a series of change, right? So we have a first cause that transcends time and has freedom, right, to bring about the universe, and is immaterial, right? An immaterial being with free will and is transcendent, and so that characterizes a creator God, and so the first cause must be a God rather than the universe.
Very good. So returning back to this, whether or not time could just go back in the past infinitely or not, a past eternal universe. You sometimes hear, and I think that perhaps Dr. Graham Oppie responded to you in a similar way in your email exchange, but I also heard Dr. Alex Malpass say something similar to Dr. William Lane Craig recently in a conversation that they had, which is when it comes to the past being actually infinite, it seems that the skeptic can say, yeah, that there may be absurdities that follow from that, like Hilbert's Hotel or the Grim Reaper paradox or things like that. But so what? Things can be absurd. That doesn't mean they're logically contradictory. And so, how do you show that a past infinite universe or the past eternal time is not just absurd, like Hilbert's Hotel demonstrates, but how do you actually show that it violates metaphysical necessity, as you mentioned in your book?
All right. Now, before I show that, before I demonstrate that and answer the question, first of all, let me start by clarifying that
Sure.
the Kalam cosmological argument does not depend on the Hilbert Hotel argument, right? So a lot of people have this misunderstanding. A lot of people think that if you can rebut the Hilbert Hotel argument, you have rebutted the Kalam. Now that is false, because as I said earlier on, there are at least 4 philosophical arguments as well as scientific arguments, right, which shows that the universe has an ultimate beginning. So even if the atheists can refute the Kalam argument, even if the atheists can refute the Hilbert Hotel argument, that doesn't mean that Kalam is refuted. No, right? Because the other arguments can still go through, right? So including the argument which I presented earlier on, right, when I used the no money analogy, right, to talk about the defender's request, right?
Right.
So that argument is not dependent on the Hilbert Hotel arguments, right? That is an independent argument, and so this is a qualifier, right? So the Kalam argument does not depend on the Hilbert Hotel argument. Nevertheless, I think that the Hilbert Hotel argument is defensible, and I think the objections used by Oppie and others can be answered. And so this is how I answer them, right? In my book, in chapter 2 of my book, I demonstrate that the Hilbert Hotel argument not only illustrates an absurdity, but it also demonstrates the metaphysical impossibility of concrete infinities. So let me explain this by using a diagram. So let me share my screen with you.
See if we can get this to work. We got it to work in our preparation, so we'll see if we can get it to work here while we're live.
Yep. Can you see my screen?
It should pop up on my screen here, and I should be able to click it. Okay, your screen should be showing.
Yep. Do you see the PowerPoint slide now?
Yes, it should be good to go.
Okay, good. So in my book, I use another analogy. Right? So instead of calling this Hilbert Hotel, I call this the Christmas present scenario. Okay. Now, so let's suppose that there is a robot generator which has been generating robots as long as time existed, right? And suppose there has been a Christmas present generator which has been generating Christmas presents as long as time existed. And suppose time is infinite in the past, right? Suppose time has no beginning. Suppose that there has been an infinite number of events in the past. Now, by the way, this is a reductio ad absurdum argument, right? Which means that we assume, right, the opposite, right, to show that the opposite conclusion is absurd, right, and which violate metaphysical necessity, right? So I'm going to say that if the past is infinite, right, something that violate metaphysical necessity will happen, right? But that cannot happen, and therefore the past is not infinite, right? Okay, so let's suppose that the past is infinite. What will happen then? Well, what will happen is that, well, we will have an infinite number of presents, of Christmas presents, and an infinite number of robots being generated, right? So if you can see on this PowerPoint, right, that at t-1, right, there is one Christmas present generated. t-2, there is one Christmas present generated, right? So the x is a Christmas present, right? So t-1, -2, -3, -4, right? So this is the past, right? Suppose now is t0, t-1, -2, -3, -4, etc. Right? So if the past is infinite, you will have an infinite number of presents, right? And you will also have an infinite number of robots, right? -1, -2, -3, etc. Right? Now, suppose each robot just grab one present, right? Now, would that be left over, right? If each robot just grab one present and there is no robot who has no present, right? Now,
No.
so the presence or absence of leftover should be independent of where the robot grabbed the present from, right? So if robot 1 choose to grab the present produced at t-1, robot -2, the robot produced at t-2 grab the present produced at t-2. If everyone just grab the present in front of him, for example, right, and then walk away, right, there'll be nothing left, right? And the robot can choose to grab whichever present he wants, right? Because there's all these presents are the same, right? So it wouldn't matter whether there's left. It wouldn't matter which presents the robot grabbed from, right? I mean, it wouldn't. As long as everyone grabbed one present, there should be no leftover. Why? Because each robot grabbing one present produced at one duration rather than the other duration has no causal power with respect to the presence of leftover presents, right? I mean, by grabbing one present instead of the other presents, the robot is not producing more presents, right? I mean, it's not making more presents. Yeah. So this is a metaphysically necessary truth, right? So what this shows is that the causal powers of a set of things ultimately depends on the members in the set. The causal powers of a set of things ultimately depend on the members in the set. Okay, so let me illustrate using another example. Right? Suppose you have no money, right, and you dream that you have money, right? Now, dreaming about money by itself has zero causal power with respect to producing money in your pocket instantly, right? I mean, you can dream that, yes, right? You can dream that you have $10,000 in your pocket, but you can check your pocket, there'll be nothing there, right? So dreaming about money has no causal power with respect to producing money in your pocket. So in this case, whether there's one person dreaming or 20% dreaming or infinite number of 20 or 10% dreaming will not make a difference, right? Because will not make a difference whether there's money in your pocket or not. Right? You can ask me to dream for you. You can ask your wife to dream, and all of us, 3 of us, can dream together. But there will still be no money in your pocket, right? Us dreaming, right? So even if an infinite number of people dreaming won't make a difference, right? Even an infinite number of people dreaming won't produce any money in your pocket. Why? Because infinity multiplied by 0 is still 0, right? Yeah. Even that each one has no causal power, right? So anything multiplied by an empty set is an empty set. So what this shows is that the causal powers of a set ultimately depends on the members of the set, right? If the members have no causal power, then no matter how many members there are, there will still be no causal power, right? So likewise, in the case of the Christmas present scenario, right, each person grabbing one present from one position rather than the other position, right? Each robot grabbing one present from rather than the other present has no causal power with respect to producing leftover, right? I already demonstrated that in the previous slide. And so what this means is that even if there's an infinite number of robots, right, they grabbing one present from one position or rather than the other would still not make a difference with regards to leftover, because infinity multiplied by 0 is still infinity. Okay, so this illustrates the premise which I'm trying to establish, right? Which is that even an infinite number of things wouldn't make a difference, right, with regards to whether there's leftover presence or not. So this is a metaphysically necessary truth. Now, However, we can now show that if there is an infinite past, then this metaphysically necessary truth will be violated, right? So look at this diagram, right? Suppose robot produced at time n grab the presence that is produced at time n, right? So as I said earlier on, right? The robot produced at t minus 1, grab the present produced at t minus 1, robot produced at t minus 2, grab the present from t minus 2, and each one just grab the present and walk away. Now, how many presents will be left over?
0.
0, right? This is very clear. Now, however, if the robots produced at time n grab the present at time 2n, right? So the robots produced at t negative 1 grab the present produced at t negative 2, the robots produced at t negative 2 grab the present produced at t negative 4. So negative 1 take from negative 2, negative 2 take from negative 4, and negative 3 take from negative 6, etc., right? So if they take it that way and they walk away, how many presents will be left?
An infinite number?
Yes, an infinite number, right? You will have the present, so the presents highlighted in yellow, right? They will be left over, right? Negative 1, 3, 5, etc., right? All the odd number, right? So those will be left over. So you will have an infinite number of presents left over. So what this shows is that whether they are leftovers or not, right, depends on where you grab the presents from, and that violates the necessary truth which I've established earlier, right? And in fact, if you grab the presents in one way or the other, you can have an infinite number of leftover presents, and you can use those presents to do other things. You can come back and grab again, right? So you can come back the second time and grab more presents, and you can come back the third time and grab more presents, and you can use those presents to build tables, houses, ships, out of nothing. It's like having no money in your pocket, and you can have an infinite amount of money in your pocket, right? Just by grabbing the presents in a certain way, right? In the right way. And so this is not just an absurdity, right? This illustrates the violation of metaphysically necessary. So this demonstrates that concrete infinities are impossible, right? So to summarize my argument can be understood. My argument can be understood as a kind of proof by contradiction, right? So if a concrete infinite exists, then principle P being that each robot grabbing a present from one position rather than another position will not make a difference as to whether there are leftovers. This principle is both true and not true, right? We can show that it is true because, as I said earlier on, infinity multiplied by 0 is still 0, right? It won't make a difference. On the other hand, I just show that it can be violated. It is not true, right? That in fact, if you grab from one position rather than the other, it won't make a difference concerning whether there's leftovers or not, right? So we can show that if an concrete infinite exists, then this principle is both true and not true, right? So it's a contradiction. And premise 2, anything that entails a contradiction cannot exist, right? And therefore, a concrete infinite cannot exist.
Right.
So this is a proof.
Yeah. Very good. Let's see if we can get you back on the screen here.
Okay, sure.
There you go. I got you there. And then I'll put me up here. Well, maybe. There we go. We're back on. Okay, so that explains why it's not just something that's absurd, but is actually a contradiction or metaphysically impossible. Now, Aquinas, of course, seemed to believe that it was not metaphysically impossible, the past being infinite, of course. He kind of famously, or infamously, said that it was actually possible, and I think it had to do with the distinction you were making earlier about dependency. His cosmological argument is very much dependent on the principle of dependency, no pun intended. And so I think he would say the reason that it's possible is because, so just to use the example that you were kind of giving earlier, your parents brought you into existence, and if you had if you had children, then you would be bringing them into existence, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the reason that this could possibly go back into the past infinitely is because once your parents brought you into existence, you're no longer dependent on them to bring your children into existence. I think that's what Aquinas would say. So why does his argument fail? Why does his argument fail?
Yeah, so basically he's assuming that once somebody existed, right, that person can bring another person into existence, and And so, for example, right, my parents brought me into existence. I brought my daughters into existence, and Aquinas will argue that the existence of my daughters are not dependent on my parents. Right? So they are not dependent on their grandparents, because their existence is dependent on me. Right? I brought them. Me and my wife brought them into existence, and so they are no longer dependent on their grandparents. And so Aquinas Aquinas thought that this is a kind of it is a kind of accidental ordered series, what he called, right? And so and therefore he thinks that the dependence argument cannot work that way, right? To demonstrate that there must be an ultimate the independent first cause. However, in my book, I argue that yes, even though the existence of my daughters is not directly dependent on my parents, even though they are not directly dependent on their grandparents, nevertheless, they are still indirectly dependent, right? Indirectly dependent in the sense that if my parents have not brought me into existence, my daughters will not exist.
Right.
So so there is still a kind of indirect dependence. And likewise, if you talk about it from a scientific point of view, right? When you think about the Big Bang, for example, so scientists would argue that the formation of water on planet Earth, for example, right? This is dependent on conditions very much earlier on, right? Near the beginning of Big Bang, right, where hydrogen is formed, right? So after the Big Bang happened, right, eventually hydrogen was formed, right? And many scientists will argue that that requires fine tuning, right? But that's another point, right? But in any case, right, the universe is so fine tuned in a way that hydrogen is formed, and that later result in the formation of water, right? So if there were no hydrogen formed near the beginning of Big Bang, right, there will be no water formed on planet Earth.
Right.
So the condition on Earth is dependent on events that happen way earlier on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's very interesting that and Aquinas was such a good thinker that I struggle to think that he wouldn't have seen that objection. That so I'd have to look into it further myself. I very much like Aquinas, and so I assume that he would have a rebuttal to that too. I don't know what it would be, but anyway, I think that.
Okay. Actually, there is a second mistake that Aquinas made, actually.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So, you mentioned that Aquinas is a great thinker. I think that he's a great thinker, but when it comes to the Kalam argument, I think he made two very stupid mistakes in my view. And so, the second mistake, Aquinas was trying to respond to Bonaventura, right? Bonaventura was the one who tried to defend the Kalam and tried to show that there must be a first cause of time, of a beginning, right? Aquinas was responding to Bonaventura, but in his response, I think Aquinas made a number of stupid mistakes. So I already explained one, and the second stupid mistake that he made was he didn't distinguish carefully between a potential infinite and an actual infinite. Right? So and this concerns the Christmas present argument which I made earlier on, right? So which is another argument, right, to show that there must be a first cause of time, right? So now interestingly, Aquinas agree that an actual infinite is impossible. Aquinas thought that actual infinite is impossible. So he would have thought that an infinite past is impossible, right? But no, because he thought that the past could be like a potential infinite.
Right.
Now you can keep thinking about the past, that I came from my parents earlier on, and earlier on could have come from another earlier period. So he thought he kind of think of the past like a future, right? Where it could be 1 more year, 2 more year into the future, and therefore there could be a 1 more year, 2 more year into the past. Right, so he thought of the past like a kind of potential infinite, right? But that is fallacious, because the past cannot be a potential infinite. Why? Because unlike the future, right? The future can be a potential infinite, because the number of events in the future, they are still increasing, right? Because according to the A theory of time, the number of events in the future, the events in the future, they are not yet. The future events are not yet, and therefore they can continue to increase. Right? Whereas the number of earlier events have already happened.
Right.
And so, for example, the number of events that is earlier than before the formation of the sun, right? The number of events that led to the formation of the sun, that number of events is a determinate whole. Right? It is no longer increasing. Right. So the past cannot be a potential infinite. Right. And so the past must either be actually finite or actually infinite, right? but it cannot be actually infinite, right? Because of the Hilbert Hotel argument, right? The Christmas argument, and also because Aquinas himself agreed that actually infinite cannot exist,
it's true.
and therefore there must be a first event in time.
That's a great point. The past can't possibly be a possible infinite. Again, no pun intended. I don't know why I keep doing that.
It cannot be,
The past can't be a potential infinite because it doesn't even have the potential to exist again, let alone grow. The future can be a past infinite. I mean, I'm sorry. The future can be a potential infinite because it actually has the potential to exist. It hasn't began to exist yet. So that would be one good reason. And to be fair, I do think that your critique of Thomas or of Aquinas is a good one. I think it probably does succeed. And I don't know if you've made up your mind on the Thomistic argument yet or not, on the Thomistic cosmological argument yet or not, but I think that I've had this critique of Aquinas for a while, being his critique of the Kalam. I'm more in line with what you're saying or with what Dr. Craig would say. But I still think that Aquinas' cosmological argument does succeed. I think you can hold both. I think you can have this critique of Aquinas when it comes to the Kalam and still think that his cosmological argument exists. I think they both work. His argument from dependency, I think, works, and then this argument also works, I think. But anyway, that'd be a whole nother discussion. We've been talking for quite a while now. I kind of want to get to see if we have any comments. I haven't opened them up yet. Maybe we have 0, but I'm going to go take a look at those, see what we got going on in the comment section. I see that we do have some viewers live with us, so if you do have a question that you want answered from Dr. Loke, now's the time to ask. If you haven't already, I'm going to go take a look at those. And while I go take a look at those, Dr. Loke, I got one last question for you, which is what all can we know about this first cause? What can we know about the nature of the first cause? What can we deduce about the nature of the first cause?
Okay, so as I explained earlier on, right, the first cause must be uncaused, right, because it is the first, right? And secondly, the first cause must be without beginning as well, right? Because everything that begins to exist will require a cause, right? So the first cause must be without beginning. That a lot of people have, right? So a lot of people have asked this question, right? If you say everything comes from God, where did God come from, right? Now, suppose God is the first cause, right? Now, the first cause didn't come from anywhere, right? Because the first cause is without beginning, right? Only things that begin to exist will require a cause, right? Because something cannot come from nothing, right? And also because of the modus tollens argument, which I presented earlier on, right? However, if something has that modus tollens argument, which I presented earlier on, shows that if something has a beginning, it will have a cause. However, if something is without beginning, if something has no beginning, then what this implies that is that it has always existed, right? Having no beginning means that it has always existed. And something that always existed doesn't require a cause because it has always been there, right? And therefore, it wasn't brought into existence, right? Rather, it has always been there, right? And therefore, the first cause, right, doesn't require a cause, right? Because it has always existed. Right. And moreover, I explained just now that the first cause must also be initially changeless, because infinite regress of change is not possible, and the first change must have been caused, right, by the first cause, which must have been initially changeless. And I also explained earlier on that the first cause must have libertarian freedom. And the first cause must be immaterial as well, right, because it is initially changeless, right, whereas material things are in constant change. And the first cause must be tremendously powerful. It must be enormously powerful. Right? And the power of the first cause can be deduced from the effect, right? The universe is so tremendous, right? The universe is so huge. The universe has billions and billions of galaxies, right? And each galaxy has billions and billions of stars, right? So the huge universe, where did that come from, right? That universe came from this first cause, and so this first cause must have tremendous power, right, to bring about this enormous, awesome universe, right, which we see, and so we have a first cause, right, that is uncaused, without beginning, initially changeless, immaterial, has libertarian freedom and enormous power, right? So that is the creator of the universe, and there we have it, right? And let me add one more point, which is that now this cosmological argument is not based on ignorance. It is not a God of the gaps argument. and this is an important point because a lot of people think that people believe in God because of gaps in their knowledge. Right? A lot of people think that a lot of people have this misunderstanding, right? A lot of people they think that the reason why people believe in God is because they don't know how to explain how the universe began, and therefore they think that it's God. Right? It's just like many people in the past, right? They don't know how to explain thunder and lightning, therefore they think that there's a thunder god, right, causing the lightning. But once we know more about science, right, we don't need to believe in the thunder god anymore, right?
Right.
So science replaces God, right, in their view, right? However, the cosmological arguments is not based on ignorance. It's not based on gaps in our knowledge. Right? Now, you have to listen carefully. When I present a cosmological argument, I did not say, right, because I don't know how to explain the universe, therefore I say it's God. I didn't say that. That's not what I said, right? Rather, the cosmological argument is based on reasons, right? I demonstrated that because we know that infinite regress is not possible, therefore there must be a first cause. Because we know that something cannot begin to exist uncaused, and therefore this first cause must be without beginning. So every step of the cosmological argument is based on reasons, right? And it's not based on ignorance, right? And therefore, the conclusion is also based on reason. It's not based on ignorance. Right? And this conclusion can never be replaced by science. Why? Because when science discovers something, right, we can always ask where did that something come from, right? So, for example, science is able to explain thunder and lightning, right, using natural laws, right? Now we can ask where did that natural law come from, right? Now, if you said that natural law come from something else, where did that something else come from, right? So, given that infinite regress is not possible, that all these the natural laws must have come from a first cause, which is a creator, as I demonstrated, right? So, science can never replace this creator. Right? Science can never refute the conclusion of the Kalam argument. Rather, science itself requires the first cause in order to explain why did the natural laws exist in the first place. And so science can never replace the creator. Rather, scientific discoveries will help us discover more and more of these natural laws which the creator has created. And so instead of science leading us away from believing God, science actually lead us, right, to recognize the wonders of God, the amazing power and intelligence of God, to bring about all these natural laws. And so science should lead us into a deeper worship of God. Yeah. To see the glory of God that is revealed in creation.
Very good. Okay, we're going to get to a couple of questions that we got from the audience in the YouTube live chat section there. Before we do, I want to say thank you to our Patreon supporters. Because of your giving is why I get to make free videos like this and put them out there on the interwebs. And of course, if you want to be a Patreon supporter, and you should, because whenever you become a Patreon supporter, you get access to the bonus segment of my interviews, which will include the bonus segment, 5 More Minutes with Dr. Andrew Loke, here briefly, that will only be accessible to patrons over at our Patreon page, which there's a link in the description. It's also patreon.com/helpmebelieve, where you can get access to that and become a patron supporter. Anyway, again, thanks so much to our patron supporters. A couple of questions for you from the audience real quick, Dr. Loke. This one comes from Theo Kapoor. And the question is, have you looked at Sean Carroll's objections to the Kalam?
Oh, yes. In my book, I responded to his objections. So one of his objections is that Sean Carroll, he thought that the causal principle may not hold, right? At the beginning, right? I mean, he claims that modern science, especially in fundamental physics, right, they have no use for the idea of causality. He thinks that the idea of cause is not present in fundamental physics. But actually, that is false, because if you look into fundamental physics, contemporary fundamental physics, you see that the idea of interaction, for example, is still present, right? So we talk about the forces interact with each other, right? And interaction is a causal concept, right? Things interact, right? Means that they causally affect each other, right? So you still find the idea of causation even in fundamental physics, right? So so what he said is actually false. And moreover, I have already given a modus tollens argument, right, to show why is it the case that everything that begins to exist has a cause, right? And Sean Carroll, he didn't give a good rebuttal, right, to this modus tollens argument, which I explain in my book. And so to find out more, you can check out my book where I respond to his arguments and demonstrate why the causal premise, the causal principle, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, why this principle is true. Yep. So that would be my response to Carol. Now, I have other response which I have no time to explain, but so that's. Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next question is from Vincent Irmedi. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sure I'm not. Let's see if I can bring it up here. There it is. It says, okay, 1 second. I'm learning how to do this, trying to bring the question up so that people can see it. Okay, it says, I understand the concrete abstract distinction, but while thoughts are abstract, conceiving of a concrete infinite seems to produce the same absurdities as a concrete infinite. In that case, what would you make then of God's tenselessly seeing an actual infinite number of future events through his omniscience? So given the arguments against the actual infinite, I'm trying to reword the question. It's kind of a long question. I think it's basically, given the arguments you have against an actual infinite, are God's thoughts about the future not an actual infinite or something, or his omniscience not an actual infinite or something like that?
Okay, now that's a great question, and it will take a long time for me to give a very detailed answer. But let me just answer very briefly, and for more details, you can check out my chapter 2 of my book, where I explain the distinction between a concrete actual infinite and an abstract actual infinite. So in my view, so I differ from Craig on this point actually, right? So Craig thinks that actual infinite is not possible, whereas for me, I think that actual infinite is possible if we are talking about abstract realm, right? So I think that abstract actual infinite is possible, but concrete actual infinite is not possible. Right? So I make a distinction between abstract and concrete actual infinite. And the key difference between a concrete actual infinite and an abstract actual infinite is that concrete entities have causal powers, right? By definition, right? By definition, when we talk about concrete things, we are talking about things that has causal powers. And if you think carefully about the argument, the Christmas present scenario, which I presented earlier on, you can see that the main issue there is that that violate metaphysical necessary truths about causation, about causality, right? When you grab things in a certain way, you can actually cause an infinite number of presents, right? You can actually bring, even though it's not supposed to happen, right? So it actually violates causation. Where we talk, and that's the problem, right, with a concrete actual infinite. Whereas if you're talking about abstract infinities, right, yeah, you can imagine all kinds of things, but that has no causal powers. That doesn't actually bring about anything, and so that is not a problem, right? And therefore, I want to clarify that my argument only applies against concrete actual infinite. It doesn't apply against abstract actual infinite. And so mathematicians can continue. So mathematicians can continue to think about abstract infinities. That's no problem. In fact, that's what David Hilbert himself said. Right, the originator of Hilbert Hotel, David Hilbert, he says that the actual infinite is solely an idea. It doesn't exist in the concrete. It is solely an idea. So you can have ideas about it. That's not a problem, right? But it cannot exist in concrete. So likewise for God, right? We can say that God can have abstract ideas. God can think about abstract ideas, right? About the future, whatever. There can be an infinite number of them that God thinks about. But these abstract ideas cannot exist in the concrete. There cannot be it cannot all exist together.
Right.
In the concrete world as an actual concrete infinite. That cannot happen.
Yeah, very good. Well, that's all the time we have for the questions. There's really all the questions we had. Dr. Loke, thanks so much for joining me. Again, to the audience, if you want to watch the bonus segment, just follow the Patreon link in the description below. If you enjoyed this, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, turn on the little notifications there on YouTube. Leave us a review if you're listening to the podcast. Really appreciate it. Dr. Loke, thank you so much. Again, I really appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Yeah. God bless.